It's T-1 day until the Beijing Winter Olympics. The State Department says American athletes have the right to protest, as more and more speak up against human rights abuses there. On the other hand, Speaker Pelosi is urging them to stay silent until they've left Beijing for their own safety. In a last-ditch effort to get its human rights narrative under control, Chinese regime officials are arresting dissidents and reining in social media chatter. The goal, to prevent people from speaking out during the Games. An Olympian sheds tears while in Beijing after she was sent into isolation for 7 days. She had been blocked from entering the Olympic Village over a positive virus test, but was still kept out, even after testing negative. And one Chinese man is headed to a U.S. prison. He's sentenced to spend 2 years there as punishment for his part in a $1 million fake iPhone scheme. Welcome to China in Focus. I'm Tiffany Meyer. Before we turn to today's news, we have a short announcement. As you may already know, YouTube has demonetized us for nearly a year. That means our ability to run ads or earn money on YouTube has been taken away. So if you like our coverage and would like to see more, consider donating. Just follow the link in the description box below. Thank you for your support as we continue to bring you the latest on China. The Winter Olympics kick off in Beijing on Friday. Concerns about Beijing's silencing of critics have been a focus in the run-up to the Games. U.S. State Department spokesman Ned Price was asked what American athletes should do if they want to protest human rights abuses in China. Price answered that they have the right to express themselves freely.
We know that the PRC uses disinformation to veil ongoing genocide in Xinjiang and other human rights abuses. We know that the PRC has made various accusations, including against U.S. athletes, and we know that's what's going on here. U.S. athletes are entitled to express themselves freely in line with the spirit and charter of the Olympics, which includes advancing human rights. We call on the PRC to respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, including that very freedom of expression.
China's persecution and mass incarceration of the Uyghur ethnic minority has prompted President Biden not to send a government delegation to the Games. Chinese officials in response have accused foreign critics of politicizing the Olympics. Price stressed that the U.S. is not coordinating a global campaign against participation in the Winter Games. Yang Xu, an official from Beijing's Olympic Organizing Committee last month, threatened certain punishment for behavior or speech that is against Chinese law. U.S. lawmakers are concerned that the Communist Party may arrest American athletes who stand up against Beijing's human rights abuses. As reports and accusations persist, Speaker of the House Nancy Pelosi is also speaking up about the Winter Games. She said Thursday the United States has an urgent moral duty to shine a bright light on Beijing's human rights abuses.
If we do not speak out against human rights violations in China because of commercial interest, we lose all moral authority to speak out against human rights violations anywhere.
But she urged U.S. athletes not to speak out while competing in Beijing for their own safety.
I would say to our athletes, you're there to compete. Do not risk incurring the anger of the Chinese government because they are ruthless. I know there is a temptation on the part of some to speak out while they are there. I respect that, but I also worry about what the Chinese government might do.
Pelosi reminded athletes not to believe the Chinese regime's so-called good intentions. With the 2022 Olympics opening ceremony just days away, maintaining social stability is at the top of Beijing's to-do list. But that term doesn't mean it's on the lookout for potential safety threats. Instead, Chinese officials are scanning for those who disagree with the regime's policies and who might speak out during the Games. To keep the silence, officials are reportedly clamping down on social media, while dissidents are getting locked up or put under house arrest. Here's more.
The Beijing Winter Olympics begin on Friday, and the Chinese Communist Party has spared no effort in making sure the event runs smoothly. That includes keeping social media on a tight leash and monitoring users' personal posts, aiming to prevent any content that doesn't align with Beijing's policy. Senior Chinese media professional Gao Yu explains, saying, "This storm of WeChat account closures is very powerful and unprecedented." He's referring to Chinese social messaging app WeChat and its recent wave of account bans. Gao also described how certain features, like the ability to access group chats, have been permanently disabled for his account since December. Other Chinese influencers have reported account restrictions too.
The CCP is afraid that these people will destroy its political image of being stable and united and wants to show off. This is definitely not normal. It violates the basic bottom line of human civilization, but it is regarded as normal by the real freak, the Communist Party.
Inside China, numbers of human rights defenders have shrunk in recent years amid rising suppression. The Winter Olympics has given the regime a renewed reason and opportunity to step it up even further. Reports say several human rights activists have disappeared or been arrested in the past few weeks alone. Among them is author Gao Feixiong. His wife recently died of cancer while living in the U.S. The Chinese regime barred Guo from leaving China to care for her and saying goodbye in person. Even those who aren't activists, but who dare to speak up against human rights violations have been targeted.
Several guards are at my door, and now we can't get out. A van is parked at the door. People inside the van are watching me and my mother 24 hours a day.
Dong Guanping is a former Chinese police officer now based in Canada. He says Beijing is using the Winter Olympics to boost its propaganda and brainwash the Chinese people.
The Communist Party is promoting the idea that the party is great among the people and that it has made many achievements. The Winter Olympics is the most important propaganda venue.
Last month, the Communist Party sentenced 11 people to jail. All of them practice Falun Gong, a spiritual meditation system based on the principles of truthfulness, compassion, and forbearance. They were jailed for sending photos capturing China's pandemic situation to New York-based newspaper The Epoch Times. One of them is painter Xu Na from Beijing. She received an 8-year sentence. The U.S. State Department condemned the verdict days later and called on Beijing to immediately end its depraved abuse and mistreatment of Falun Gong practitioners.
Criticisms over China's human rights issues are getting louder as the Games draw near. On the eve of the opening ceremony, a Reuters report shared a message from the Beijing Olympics Organizing Committee. A spokesperson said the Games start on Friday will turn attention away from criticism over human rights. The spokesperson, Zhao Weidong, also denied the rights abuse accusations, calling them lies made up by those with so-called ulterior motives. The opening ceremony kicks off Friday, and now Team Taiwan says it will be present for both the opening and closing ceremonies. The news follows a statement from the International Olympic Committee, or IOC, requiring Taiwan to participate. Taiwan is sending 4 athletes to Beijing. Last week, the island had announced its team would be delayed in getting to China and wouldn't attend the opening or closing ceremonies. Taiwan officials cited flight holdups and tough pandemic rules for the absence. But a senior Taiwan official familiar with the matter revealed another reason. They say Taiwan is concerned Beijing could place Team Taiwan athletes beside those from Hong Kong. That placement would be viewed as a downgrade for Taiwan's political status. Hong Kong is officially part of China, while Taiwan enjoys its own constitution and democratically elected leaders. Despite that, Beijing claims Taiwan as its own territory. And placing Taiwan's athletes next to Hong Kong's would be seen as putting the two on the same level. For most international sporting events, including the Olympics, Taiwan doesn't compete under its common name or its official name, the Republic of China. Instead, it's been using the name of its capital city, Chinese Taipei, for the past 4 decades. That's to distinguish itself from Beijing. The 2022 Winter Olympics come amid heightened tensions between China and Taiwan, particularly military aggression, as Beijing repeatedly sends fighter jets into the island's defense zone. Another focus in the run-up to the Olympics, Beijing's strict preventive measures amid the pandemic. Belgium skeleton racer Kim Milesman has finally entered the Olympic villages. The 25-year-old Olympian tested positive for the CCP virus, which causes COVID-19, upon her arrival in Beijing. She was taken to isolate and had to do several tests before getting permission to enter the Olympic village. But even after testing negative, she was not immediately taken to the Olympic Village. Instead, she was moved to another facility by ambulance for 7 days of isolation. She tearfully shared about her experience on Instagram.
Obviously, this is very hard for me. So I ask you all to give me some time to consider my next steps, because I'm not sure I can handle 14 more days and the Olympic competition while being in this isolation.
Belgian Olympic officials, as well as International Olympic Committee, or IOC, later intervened. Milesman updated fans on her situation Wednesday, saying she was moved to an isolation wing inside one of the Olympic villages. She said she felt safe and would be better able to train.
It seems like the video, and especially also the efforts of my Olympic committee, have really paid off.
IOC spokesman Christian Klauer wrote on Twitter that he was relieved to learn about Milesman's update. Olive Spaal, Belgium's head of Mission Beijing 2022, said the team's priority was getting Milesman to the village as quickly as possible.
We believe that in this approach to COVID measures, the athlete must remain central.
Official training for women's skeleton racing starts next week, ahead of the competition starting on February 12th. Exiled Tibetan protesters are denouncing what they call the truth about China. Dressed up as Communist leader Xi Jinping, one of them handed out fake Olympic medals. But instead of honoring athletic achievement, the mockery medals award achievement in genocide. Protesters say the Olympics are an attempt to glorify what's really happening behind the scenes.
Hundreds of Tibetans from at least 8 different countries in Europe gathered Thursday outside the International Olympic Committee's Swiss headquarters. They carried signs with slogans like "No rights, no games" and 2022 Genocide Olympics. Many were draped in Tibetan flags. They marched behind a small police escort.
We are against IOC granting this precious game to a country, to a regime which is a dictatorship rule, which doesn't respect any rule of law.
She said more than 150 Tibetans self-immolated after the 2008 Beijing Summer Games. That's because of what they described as much repression in Tibet. Outside Europe, another group of Tibetans held a demonstration in northern India Thursday. That's just one day before the Beijing Winter Olympics opening. The eye-catching protest included activists and students. Blindfolded demonstrators dressed as athletes and wore tape on their mouths as they received imitation Olympic medals. The so-called genocide medals were handed out by another protester, wearing a mask of Chinese Communist leader Xi Jinping's face.
Olympic is trying to glorify what is not actually China, the brutality, the occupation, the suppression happening in Tibet and other occupied countries. We are trying to represent that here.
Overseas Tibetan and Uyghur rights groups have called for an international boycott of the Beijing Olympics. That starts Friday, the same day as the Games opening ceremony. It's part of protests against human rights abuses in Tibet and the Xinjiang region.
A Chinese man is set to spend over 2 years in a U.S. prison. He was sentenced on Tuesday for his part in a conspiracy to defraud Apple out of more than $1 million, all through a fake iPhone scheme.
Wu Hai-tung immigrated to the U.S. in 2013 to earn a master's degree. From 2016 to 2019, Wu had fake iPhones from China shipped to him in Hong Kong. The fake devices had international mobile equipment identity numbers and serial numbers corresponding to genuine iPhones. He and his conspirators returned the fake devices to Apple, claiming they are genuine, and had them replaced with real iPhones. Then they sold them in China. The scheme cost Apple about $1 million. Wu was ordered to pay about $2 million in restitution and penalties. 2 other Chinese citizens, including Wu's wife, were found guilty of similar offenses. Wu's wife got 5 months in prison, and the other person is set to be sentenced next month.
Japan's parliament is taking up a new resolution. The legislation takes aim at what it calls the serious human rights situation in China. Adopted Tuesday by the lower chamber, it asks the Japanese government to take steps to relieve the situation and expresses concerns over Communist China's human rights abuses, religious freedom violations in Hong Kong, Tibet, and Xinjiang. Beijing responded to the move hours later on Tuesday. Officials called it slander and said it interferes in China's internal affairs. According to a report from GG News Agency, Japan remains concerned about the potential economic impact of the move. Despite that, Japan's ruling Liberal Democratic Party pushed to adopt the resolution ahead of Beijing's Winter Olympics. The Games are slated to begin Friday. The parliamentary resolution calls on the Japanese government to work with global allies to tackle the issue.
On basis of the purpose of the resolution which was just passed, the government will continue to work steadily in close cooperation with the international community.
Japan is one of the U.S.'s most important allies in the Indo-Pacific region. It's also home to the most advanced technology in Asia. On top of human rights issues, Japan seems to be re-examining its financial ties to China, too. The country is halting its aid to China, which it's been handing over for over 40 years. The funding normally covers important areas for economic growth, including finance, technology, infrastructure projects in the energy sector, and communications. But just how much aid has Japan been giving? According to Japan's Official Development Assistance Department, Japan provided $32 billion to China in 2015. Of that money, $1.35 billion was non-reimbursable, meaning China doesn't need to pay it back. Another $29 million went to loans with terms and conditions favorable to China. And $1.6 billion were earmarked for technical project assistance. Those numbers represent what Japan gave China in just a single year. But what prompted Japan to aid China in the first place? Back in the 1980s, China was still a developing country and was just starting to open its doors to foreign relations. Like the U.S. and other democratic countries, Japan had believed the communist regime would become more democratic through trade and foreign aid. Those nations didn't realize until years later it was actually doing the opposite. Now, the Chinese Communist Party is seen as moving further and further away from democracy and freedom. For Japan, there's also another factor in play, pushing it to stop the aid. That is, China didn't tell its people about the Japanese aid. On the contrary, Beijing has been souring relations between the two nations, rather than publicly fostering them by revealing the aid. The tactic is a common one from Beijing's playbook. It's usually pulled out when the regime is in crisis mode and in need of a common enemy. The so-called enemy nation is then used to unite Chinese citizens and direct their attention away from domestic problems. Now we look to one of the most important allies of the U.S., the European Union, or EU. 2022 looks set to be an important year for Germany and the EU regarding their China policy. That's according to Germany's Foreign Office Minister Tobias Lindner. Lindner spoke on Saturday at MERIX about the country's perspective on China relations. The Mercator Institute for China Studies, or MERIX, is a German think tank. The Chinese regime blacklisted the organization last year, together with some scholars and members of the European Parliament. The move came after the European Union sanctioned 4 Xinjiang officials for committing human rights abuses. The Chinese Communist Party's upcoming 20th Congress will decide whether the regime's leader Xi Jinping will hold a third term. Lindner says the decision will impact China's relations with the European Union and Germany. The minister says Germany's new government will adopt another new and comprehensive China strategy. He says under Xi Jinping, the Communist Party appears less willing to compromise in promoting its interests. But giving Lithuania as an example, Lindner says the European Union will speak out against Beijing if it bullies smaller states using economic coercion.
We are facing a China that openly promotes its authoritarian model of government, including in United Nations institutions, while arguing that its own political system is inherently superior to democracy.
He added Beijing is determined to shape international norms, rules, and standards. However, he said China's achievements are not all based on fair competition.
Not all of this is a result of unfair competition, let me be clear. But rules and practices bent in favor of Chinese companies play an important part.
So Lindner says while seeking cooperation with China, the EU and Germany will take a strategic approach. He says they will examine whether Beijing is conforming with their values and interests, and they will keep an eye on the results. Lindner goes on to say the European Union can exert influence on China, and that it should work on this with their like-minded partners around the world.
We need new and stricter rules on state subsidies.
Further, Lindner says the European Union will more proactively address fundamental disagreements with the regime, for example, on human rights issues.
We will be sure to address them in our relations with China and to put a stronger emphasis on values and human rights in our China policy.
He says all these changes will likely be difficult to implement, considering Beijing's growing assertiveness. But he warns that failing to address disagreements now will cost democracies dearly in the long run. And that's all for today's China in Focus. Thanks for watching, and see you tomorrow.